Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt, the host today, and I'll be speaking with Conor Bednarski, who's a Cornell law student, but also an activist with the Ithaca Tenants Union. And we'll be talking about how to get to housing that people can afford. It'll be a mix of our visions for housing, but also some real history. And I'll start with some real history. Almost 2 years ago, in these times, the magazine had an article in the October 2018 issue that was called How Unions Can Solve the Housing Crisis by Eric Forman. It actually started before unions were particularly involved in 1916, when in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, some Finnish immigrant workers in the Finnish Socialist Club realized that they could do better pooling their money and building housing better than paying rent. And so 6 families pooled their assets. They took more loans from their neighbors. Then they got a bank loan for nearly the other half of the cost. In a year, they had a house. In 10 years, there were almost 30 such little co-ops. And it was an experimental thing. There was, New York State law didn't know what it meant. But later on, in the early 20s, the state law did come around to recognizing the idea of limited equity co-ops. Limited equity co-op means you buy into it, you can sell out, but when you sell out, you can't do it at a big profit. The next to act were some Yiddish-speaking IWW communists who sold bonds among themselves and built United Workers Cooperative Colony in the far north Bronx. 2 buildings in a then fashionable style. And the next step, amalgamated houses, was actually initiated by staff and members of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. And this is where unions start to get involved in financing limited equity cooperatives. After World War II, other unions built housing, IBEW, ILGWU, and then along comes the state Mitchell-Lama program that helps them. The ILGWU initiated Penn South, which was also a slum clearance project. And in that sense, it became a bit problematic, but it's a great tract of high-rises just southwest, called Penn South because it's just southwest of Pennsylvania Station, or Pennsylvania Railroad Station, and the General Post Office. I know about it because my sister-in-law lives there. It was a very good in that they actually generate their own electricity. And when, I think it was Hurricane Sandy wiped out power in most of New York City, there was an island of light at Penn South. The biggest, but also the last co-op, union involved, state involved building was Co-op City in the Bronx, well over 15,000 units, a population bigger than the city of Ithaca, completed in 1972. And then you might say capitalism and capital struck back. with a capital strike, denying the city the ability to issue bonds, putting the city under an emergency fiscal control board, imposing austerity. And that was the end of such building in New York City. Of course, where there's a political will, there is probably also a way. Now, I mentioned along the way Mitchell-Lama, and I think, Conor, you probably know more about it.
Right. So Mitchell-Lama came about in 1955 as a part of a new piece of post-war legislation giving some government tax abatements to affordable housing creation. And as Theresa said, it was part of this big development of these housing cooperatives. Up in the Bronx was one of them, Penn South was one of them. And these major developments of housing were built with income limits on the new tenants, with the express purpose of creating low to middle income affordable housing in New York City. One of the unfortunate things about this Mitchell-Lama program is that these tax abatements and the restrictions that the city of New York put on the houses was a 20-year sunset on the abatement. So after 20 years, the owners of the buildings who had built them with government subsidies had the option to privatize the buildings. And it's kind of the capitalism strikes back moment, right? Where the tenants who had bought in at a low entry rate, purchasing these kind of limited equity cooperatives were then given the proverbial carrot waved in front of their face of, the opportunity to sell their now market rate apartment, sell their apartments at now market rate, and then take this formerly public housing into the private market. So it was a clever move, I think, by the capitalist ruling class then to take this designated public housing and then pull it back into the private stock. So unfortunately, we've seen kind of a siphoning away of that large amount of public housing that was built through Mitchell-Lama, kind of get grabbed back and pulled back into the private realm.
Yeah. I do get the impression, though, that somebody who bought in the past is able to remain living there. At least I know I have one long ago friend. Can't remember when he got into this, I'm pretty sure Mitchell-Lama building, but he is still there, like 40 years later or 30 years later.
No, that's correct. You're not forced to get out by any means. And they don't really increase your rent by that much. If you do have a kind of significant comeuppance in your financial means, then you get assessed a surcharge on top of your normal kind of monthly maintenance fee, but it doesn't become exorbitant. Really, the thing that pushes people out of these affordable buildings is that they're now presented with an opportunity to sell their prime co-op in the heart of Manhattan, as you said, for sometimes 10 times the value that they purchased it for, right? So it's kind of that individual choices lead to bad outcomes, I guess.
Yeah, the New York City housing market is kind of bonkers from my point of view, and some people do make out like bandits.
Yeah, certainly.
And of course, ironically, that actually, in a sense, makes up for some people, for the lack of social protections for lower income older people. Well, at least they've got this apartment they can sell. Right.
But, so on the individual level, I think it's great, to a big builder of individual wealth, right? But on the kind of larger meta political level,
yeah,
unfortunately, it's taking away what I believe there should be affordable housing that is permanent, Right.
Right. It should
So
be.
it's tough to balance, I think. I think
Yeah.
it's really tough.
Yeah. But it would be helpful even to get some such program back, or perhaps a better one back. There have been some major changes in Albany. The state Senate changed considerably, looks to be changing even more so now, and, you know, has become more friendly toward tenants. And one suspects that the problem will be the governor. Again, I have my memories of him and housing from the 1990s, when I was for 4 years on the board of the Ithaca Housing Authority, the public housing, you know, the governing board of public housing in the city of Ithaca. And we would get these very contradictory directives that we had to write little local regulations that were in accord with those federal directives, which on the one hand said that tenants ought to be involved in the governance of the cooperative and, you know, run for the board and things like that. And on the other hand said that they should be busily engaged in trying to get out of public housing, which I thought was a real contradiction in terms. Well, the head of HUD at that time was Andrew Cuomo. Yeah, a checkered past. Well, there are some related but other ideas about, and now we go more into the realm of ideas, I think, although some of this may be related to what we've said. So Conor Bednarski, tell us about community land trusts, that concept.
Yeah, so community land trust is a different model of setting up the ownership of homes, right? Similar in the way of limited equity partnerships that you were talking about, where there's an express intent to limit the financial gain that individuals are having. You're not owning land for the purpose of profiting off of it, right? You're owning the land for the purposes of building community that can mutually sustain the group of people that live there. So usually they include some kind of a subsidy to bring the initial price of the units down from the government, and frequently they'll have kind of qualified buyer requirements. So it's like, designated for low to moderate income individuals, so that you're not getting some kind of rich people who are just trying to skate by, get another kind of tax break or something. And then maybe you're going to have a long-term then mechanism like a deed covenant or some kind of ground lease that establishes who owns the land or restricts what you can do with the unit that's on the land, whether that be a house or an apartment unit if you're in New York City. But it's going to place these kind of affordability restrictions, so you can't just freely sell the apartment or house for as much as the market would demand, but rather it's going to give you some kind of a much smaller percentage, or maybe you're only able to sell it for the price that you bought it for, but it's going to maintain the affordability of the land that you're living on.
So the point is that you buy into this land trust to have a place to live, not to speculate and have a nest egg.
Right. No, that's correct. And it kind of gets back to this idea of, if we're thinking about housing as a human right and everybody has a right to be safe and feel and have a home, then why are we subjecting this to the whims of a market, right? Where people are going to be motivated to make it as restrictive as possible or overpriced as possible, so that only a certain number of people can really have affordable and safe and enjoyable housing. So this is kind of, you're putting a legal mechanism in place so that it is established that you're not bringing those kind of market forces in, right? You're restricting it with that deed covenant. So for the long term, this is what you're getting into. You buy your house and then you're safe there. You can stay, you're not going to kick you
Yeah.
out whether you increase your income or not, but you're not just able to then flip your property the moment that you have a more favorable kind of market around you. That's not the purpose of these community land trusts.
Okay, and I believe this is being done. This type of mechanism is being done in Ithaca on a small scale.
Yeah.
For instance, by INHS.
Yeah, they do exist, and usually they would have like a nonprofit like INHS that, or kind of quasi-governmental entity that's going to manage the property and that's going to kind of enforce these restrictions that you have on the deed covenants. They're going to so you can't just go out and do kind of a person-to-person transaction because there are limitations on who owns the land and who's allowed to buy in and what you're allowed to sell it for. So that would, it would be a kind of nonprofit that is an express goal of trying to maintain affordable housing, right? Their goal is to maintain, affordable housing stock for the working class, for the moderate income kind of people, and it's not to, maximize individual wealth.
Right. So something that is feasible, and perhaps there would be a way to get more of it, we hope.
Right. And hopefully with, if you're going to give out government subsidies for housing, why not expressly do it for the people, to the people, and set it up and structure it in a way so that it can be maintained for the people for the long term.
Right. Not just a temporary tax credit and then poof, it's over. There's no more restrictions or whatnot.
Right.
Now, at almost exactly the same time as In These Times came out with its article, a month later, Jacobin magazine comes out with another article on models, a different set of models for affordable housing. And Conor, I think you read it and we're going to report on it.
Yeah, something fascinating about this article is that it really details the rich history of public housing throughout other countries. I know we don't, maybe in New York City, there's an extensive public housing system, but in the United States, it seems like a very foreign idea, right? That we're going to provide housing for all the people. It kind of runs counter to this idea that everyone has to go out and earn their own stake. I mean, I think it's a terrible, terrible philosophy that we have here, but, it really runs counter to that. There's this idea that you were mentioning before that public housing is really just a place that you need to be until you have to better yourself and you can get out, right? This article really details that there's like a commitment to living in this cooperative public space, and having a cooperative grocery store there, having a cooperative milk delivery man, and this is kind of dating it now, right? But having a school there, having a library, having communal gardens and bathhouses and swimming pools, and really finding that foundation of the community in where you live, and not just isolating into your own personal little apartments, but really building a community that you could live in for the long term.
And there were several different models mentioned from different places.
Right, and I think the gold standard of these models is the Red Vienna project that has built a series of housing developments in Vienna. And I think you have a close relationship with, Theresa.
Well, I wouldn't say a close relationship, but definitely a relationship. Yes, because my parents are from Vienna, and my mother especially, I mean, both my parents, but especially my mother, was a socialist activist in Vienna in the 20s and 30s. And of course, it was the socialists who built, who began this project of building, actually, before, at a time when my mother was just a child. Because, so I mean, she wouldn't have any responsibility for it happening.
Yeah.
But, was taking part in that movement subsequent, shortly after.
Yeah.
World War I had ended in Vienna with, Austria lost. There was considerable, at least, I don't think there was quite as much of the physical devastation as followed World War II, but there was total economic devastation. I mean, basically, my mother remembers being fed from soup kitchens, or remembered. I mean, she was born in 1908. She is, long gone. And in 1919, a socialist government was elected in Vienna. And in the next few years, they levied some heavy taxes on those people who had money. And in the next few years, they started a massive public housing building project, including in the 20s, an absolutely huge development called Karl Marx Hof. Karl Marx Courts, you might say, in a kind of suburban area, but right near a suburban railroad line. And that's still how you probably would get there today. You take the train from somewhere central out to this station, walk out of the station, cross a major street, and there it is. It's still standing nearly 100 years later. It is still considered a good place to live. So it was solidly built housing with gracious little touches, some statuary. In the Central European tradition, you get a large kind of rectangular building and then a grassy courtyard, and a large grassy courtyard in the middle. So separated from the streets, a place where children can play, where you can have little playgrounds and benches and whatnot. People still live there today. But also the old laundry room, which kind of became superfluous when people started to have their own washing machines in their own apartments, has been turned into a museum. On a not so long ago visit to Vienna, actually first I guess I first heard through my father's widow that there was such a museum. And then some years later, my husband and I made a visit, and we asked about, we thought we had blown it, because at least at that time, it was only open 2 days a week. We were there on the wrong day. Fortunately, this second, distant cousin of mine, whom we were visiting with, is a really assertive type. And so she gets on the phone and she arranges a special tour, which we paid for, of course. Very impressive, because they not only, much as you somewhat said, they not only built housing, they built swimming pools, they built places for children to play, they built childcare centers, they built clinics. A lot of what you need to live right there on the spot.
Yeah, and I think that kind of bears through still, right? Like that this beautiful large scale housing project was built with a vibrant community, and a lot of these other housing projects were built in Vienna, and the architecture and the building stood the test of time, and also the cultural significance really stood the test of time. And you see that in their the people there have a much larger kind of commitment to public housing and housing for the good of the people, compared to here.
Yes, it has definitely kept up. I just saw the statistic, more than half the population of Vienna lives in public housing, 62% or something like that was cited. Another memory from a visit, by the way, and this must have been nearly 10 years ago. friends of ours, we've been in Croatia, friends of ours there said, oh, and when you go to Vienna, you really have to take a look at the Hundertwasser house. It's architecturally really incredible. It's a little bit maybe reminiscent of Gaudi. Probably somebody who really knows architecture would say you're all wet on that. But, you know, all sorts of strange turrets and things. And she said, but it's actually apartments for ordinary people. Okay, so we visit Vienna for our scholarly purposes. We have some free time. We go and, you know, look up where the building, this house is. We take a look at it. You can't go in because people are living there, but you can walk around the outside. We walk around the outside, walk to the front. Thankfully, I can read German. And it says, the plaque says, built by the city of Vienna. It was public housing. I don't think our friends in Zagreb even knew that it was public housing. They just knew that it was architecturally interesting. And it kind of shows the confidence that has developed in what public housing can be.
Yeah, no, that's great.
So I guess I will just maybe end with a quote from my aunt, who was also a young activist in those days, marching around the Ring Street on May Day and wearing a red bathing suit and shouting, only red Vienna builds swimming pools. Nur die rote Gemeinde Wien baut Bäder. And I think that brings us to our end, but there are some visions of what public housing could be. I have been speaking with law student at Cornell, Conor Bednarski, about visions for affordable housing. I'm Theresa Alt. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. Thanks for watching.